Okay, thank you very much. This budget work session is called to order. Um, A few announcements before we begin tonight. For those who are watching, you may access tonight's agenda and related meeting documents by going to the FCPS website, select School Board, and then upcoming meetings and agendas. The meeting is also being streamed live on the FCPS website homepage. Click on Watch School Board Live. And we have one person. Please turn off or silence your cell phone. And before I call on Dr. Garza, I want to remind my colleagues that another batch of answers to budget questions have been posted, and I know everybody's been waiting to get the answers, and a large batch of them were posted today. And you will see it either under Board Docs, under Library, or in your inbox in Outlook. Okay? Dr. Garza.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Strauss. Members of the board, I also want to remind the public that I didn't go back and count, but there have been many work sessions leading up to the development of the proposed fiscal year 17 budget. So it's not done in isolation. Of course, the work continues, but did want to remind the community of that. In addition to that, we take quite a lot of pride in making sure that we're recognizing in that process the priorities that have been stated by the board. And so in the fiscal year 17 budget, the two priorities that have been repeatedly expressed by the board, certainly over time, has been compensation for our employees, and we must continue to address class size. And those are the two most significant changes to our budget. As superintendent of the school system, I'm obligated to represent a needs-based budget. There's a reference in statute along that line. I will tell you that the budget that's been proposed to you all for your consideration is not a needs-based budget. It doesn't come close to meeting all of our needs as a system, but it does, I believe, represent our most pressing needs as a school system, and that is being more competitive with our salaries and continuing to address our challenges with elementary class size. Some of you heard me speak before that in fiscal year 15, my first year here, and you'll see some work tonight that Kristen Michael will be showing to you. But in fiscal year 15, we worked very closely with the Board of Supervisors, trying to answer questions that have been on their minds for many years. But at the same time, we knew that we had a significant challenge facing us. We had significant cost drivers that were outside of our control that we had to fund. And so as such, I presented a budget that was a shared approach, cutting about $98 million worth of cost out of our system, and then asking for about the same amount of money from the Board of Supervisors. That was a 5.7% increase to the transfer, and that we ended up getting 3%. In fiscal year 16, again, we approached the budget trying to be responsive and good partners with our Board of Supervisors, and also in light of what we knew was going to be happening in fiscal year 17, because we knew this was coming. We've been talking about this for many years, and we said in light of what's ahead in fiscal year 17, we're going to get as close to budget guidance as we possibly can. So I cut another $65 million out of our operating cost, and presented a request to the Board of Supervisors for 3.99%, and we got 3%. So as we face and look at fiscal year 17, like I said, we knew this was coming, and so we put together our next round of cuts we knew we'd be facing would be cuts to programs and services, and we knew that we could not do that without the opportunity for our public to be engaged in that process. And so we started a really unique and different way of engaging our public with the budget tool, which was very well received. Thousands of people submitted budget guidance or information to us on that online tool. And then we put together the budget task force to help us at least capture how the community would have us think about cuts should we not be funded at the level we need to in this budget. So while I did not propose a budget with cuts, I will tell you that if in fact we're not funded at the level that this proposed budget has in it, then we will have to go to that list of potential cuts. And in my view, I think it's important for our community, and they know what the possibilities are. And I think that positions us in a much better place than we would otherwise. So on the first slide on our presentation tonight, I'm only going to talk about the first slide, and then Kristen's going to handle the rest. We have a very short presentation, and then we'll get to your questions tonight. As I indicated before, the budget is a reflection of only our most pressing and most basic needs in the system. It does include no reductions to instructional programs or services to students in schools, and as I indicated before, doing so at this juncture, I think, while in fiscal year 15 I proposed significant cuts, probably historic cuts to the system. I don't think we've ever had one budget year where we've had that amount of cut in one year. Fiscal year 16, yet more cuts. In this budget, there's yet some more savings, but there's no reductions to instructional programs and services because I don't believe that's best for our system. Looks ahead to the slow process of rebuilding from the cuts that we've sustained since 2008, and I've had people ask about, are those cost avoidances when we talk about the annual cuts since 2008 that equate to almost about $500 million. Those are not cost avoidances. Those are actual cuts. And we have those, and Kristen, I think we'll talk about that in just a minute. We've shown that to the Board of Supervisors. We've had that available for some time, but we can show you annually what did that include. So those are very real cuts to the system. And then finally, it adds, this proposed budget does add funding for our most pressing needs, and that is for our employee salary increases. There is a across-the-board salary increase for all of our employees. That is about the same as it is for county employees. And then there's additional money for an investment into our teacher scale to help us get more competitive, and then some additional investment in lowering our elementary class size. Kristen will also show you or demonstrate to you that what will happen if we do not get but just the 3%, which was provided in the budget guidance. That would present us with a $67.9 million gap. And I will tell you, if you've not been through the budget tool yet, I would encourage you still to do that because it's very difficult to even get to 50. So that's a challenge, daunting number that I would encourage you to look at what that might look like. I understand as we start to have the discussions about the budget, there are lots of pressures. I certainly feel them, maybe not to the extent you do as elected officials, but certainly I'm mindful of those pressures. But I will tell you, I believe very strongly that this budget is what our system needs today. It is a reflection of our needs, and I would just encourage you, on behalf of this great system, I would encourage you to support this proposed budget as we move forward. I will tell you, we stand ready to answer any questions that you have. We want you to feel equipped and ready to make those decisions. And then, of course, we know that this process does not complete itself until May. So this is kind of the first major hurdle in the process. So with that, Kristen, I'm going to let you go into the brief overview, and you've heard it before, but we think it's important for us to have, yet a brief overview of the proposed budget.
So thank you. The FY17 proposed budget for the school operating fund is an increase of $121.4 million, or 4.8%, over the FY16, or the current year's approved budget. As Dr. Garza stated, this increase will fund two key investments: reducing class size at the elementary school level and addressing employee compensation. The majority of the increase in the FY17 budget does represent that modest investment in our employees, which includes a step increase for eligible employees, a 1% market scale adjustment for all employees, and a $40 million initial investment in our teacher salaries. So I wanted to take just a minute before we talk about the impact of the step on the 1% market scale and have us look at the teacher salary scale, which is on the screen. So this is a standard 194-day teacher scale. The education level is reflected in the lanes, or the columns, and then the individual's experience is shown in the rows. Those are what people refer to typically as steps. So a teacher who's currently in his or her 10th year of teaching, who has a master's degree, would be on step 10. So that salary would be $63,414. So if a step is granted, that teacher next year would have 11 years of experience, and he or she would move to step 11. So that salary would increase to $65,252. So STEP doesn't in any way adjust our salary scales. It's just how a current employee moves through the scales based on their years of experience. So if we look at that in comparison to a market scale adjustment, the proposed budget includes a 1% market scale adjustment for all employees. And that will adjust our salary scales upward by 1%. So that salary scale on the previous slide, in the event that a 1% market scale adjustment is given, every number on that scale would increase by 1%. So that impacts our competitiveness. So when teachers are looking, they look at our salary scale and they see that starting teacher salary, or they look and say, I'm a teacher with 10 years of experience, and they would look at that salary scale, they would find how many years of experience they have, their education level, and they would identify their salary. So the market scale adjustment is what moves the salary scale.
In this spring, as we look at our compensation study, there will be some decisions moving forward about how we might want to, and this board will be very involved in that. Do we want as many lanes? We could reduce the number of lanes. There could be lots of things that we could change, but our current schedule is reflected in this presentation.
So if we look at comparing our competitiveness with surrounding school districts, one of the things is at this early stage in the proposed process, it's difficult to know what all of the jurisdictions are going to propose in terms of salary increases for next year, and then ultimately what will be funded. So the thing to remember is if every jurisdiction also gave their employees a 1% market scale adjustment, all of our scales would increase by 1%, and our competitiveness, where we're at as compared to the other districts, wouldn't change because all of our increases were the same. Now, in the event that FCPS didn't give a market scale adjustment, but the other jurisdictions did, we would lose ground because their salary scales would increase while ours stayed flat. When we look at a step increase, it doesn't impact our competitiveness because it's only moving the employee based on his or her years of experience through our current scale. So our FY17 budget includes a transfer increase request from the county of $122.7 million, or 6.7% from the FY16 transfer level. So as Dr. Garza stated, that's 3.7% higher than the Board of Supervisors guidance. So if the Board of Supervisors only provides a 3% transfer, that will leave us with a gap of $67.9 million. Now our county transfer is increasing at 6.7%, whereas our total budget is increasing at 4.8%. And that's because the county transfer provides the largest portion of our revenue, about 72%, and that's increasing at a different rate than our other revenue categories. So we have a greater increase in the county transfer that funds our overall budget increase of that 4.8%. So if we look over time, this chart illustrates the county transfer shown in the yellow line. That's the increase in the transfers compared to the previous year that we received from FY13 through what a 3% transfer would be in FY17 is that solid yellow line. The dashed yellow line in FY17 shows our request. So what you see in the dark colored bars are our budget drivers, just the cost for our enrollment growth and student demographic changes, the cost for healthcare, retirement, and employee salary increases. So you can clearly see that all of those budget drivers have been significantly more than the increase in the funding that we've received from the county. So in order to balance our budget, we've been required to take reductions in each of those years. And those reductions over that time period from 2008 until current total nearly $500 million.
On that same note, I think it's important, if you'll go back to that slide, Kristen, it's also important to note we've grown since about 2008 by over 22,000 students. So it's not as if we were a school system that has been flat in enrollment, which has exacerbated some of these challenges. So if we had not been cutting each of these years, we would have had to ask for a lot more than what we've been asking for. So even though people think that in whatever their worldview is, whether it's too much or not enough, it would have been a lot more that would have been asking for if we had not also cut.
So this next slide shows two different things. First is the change in the county transfer, which is shown in the dark green line. So when you first glance at it, what you can immediately see is in FY11, our transfer from the county actually decreased as compared to the prior year. So that's why that's below the line. We actually saw a decrease. And then in FY10 and FY12, the transfer was basically flat, so no increase. So then you can see the other years when the transfer increased. The light color green on each of these slides shows the reductions that FCPS had to take in the budget. So if you combined the increase in the county transfer with the reductions that we took, that really shows you what our true need was each year. And what you can see when you look at this chart is, with the exception of FY13, in each year the reductions that we took totaled more than the increase in funding from the county. So this slide shows the county transfer increase over time. It goes all the way back into the 1990s. What it shows is the transfer request that was included in our proposed budget. That's the % increase over the prior year actual. Then it also shows the transfer increase in the approved budget, or the advertised and the approved. The column on the far right is the actual transfer, and you'll notice in some years that the actual transfer differed from what was included in our approved budget. And it differs because those are the times when the county gave us additional funding at year end. So if we look back in FY 2007, the county provided us with an additional $8 million at year end. And then in FY11, many of you will remember that the county provided us at year end with $1.3 million for our Priority Schools initiative. So that's why in some of those years you'll see the actual is slightly different than the approved. The percentage changes are small though, because in each of those cases, those adjustments were very small adjustments as compared to the total increase in county funding. So when you look at the slide, you can really see that we've requested transfers going from a high of 15.41 in 2001 at the advertised budget stage, all the way to 2.95 in 2012. So if we look back just to last year, our FY16 approach, when we requested 3.99%, that was the closest that we've ever come in terms of budget guidance, and then you can see the actual transfer that we received is 3.2%. So if we think about local funding and compare to the surrounding school districts, this chart shows the surrounding school districts who've released their proposed budget prior to today. You can see that there are 5 districts in addition to FCPS that have released those proposed budgets. So far, of all of those districts, FCPS has the smallest increase in our proposed budget as compared to the current year's approved budget at 4.8%. So that's in that first column. You can see the highest request over the prior year budget is Prince George at 12%, Loudoun County at 8.8%, Alexandria City at 6.9%, Montgomery at 5.8%, Falls Church City at 5%. So in order to fund those, you can also see in the last column what the % request increase in their local funding is. And those range again from a high of 19.1 for Prince George's to Falls Church City, which is 5.4%. So only Falls Church City and Alexandria City have a lower request heading into FY17. But you can see that Montgomery, Loudoun, and Prince George are all requesting a much higher increase than FCPS. So if we look back over time and look at historically how have school districts' budgets increased, this is data from the Washington Area Boards of Education Guide, and it's comparing the operating fund budget increase with the prior year. Now, for the purpose of WABE comparison, we've all agreed to use a standard format for our operating fund. So it includes not only our operating fund, but our entitlement grants, adult education, so it's consistently looking at all of those districts. So I put the FY17 proposed request on there as a reference point. That's the first column. And then you'll see FY16 going back to FY12, as well as the average at the end for the years that are on this screen. So if you look historically, FCPS's budget increase over the prior year compares very favorably with the surrounding districts, with an average during this 5-year period of a 3.3% increase from the prior year's approved budget. So when you look over time, only Montgomery and Prince George's County have a lower increase. Now it's important to note, neither of those districts were impacted by the Virginia retirement system shift. And also when you're comparing total budget increases, it's not taking into account other factors for things like increases in enrollment. right? So this is kind of a rough way to look at how much budgets have increased. Really looking at cost per pupil that we regularly prepare for the board is a great way to look exactly at what each district is spending per student.
And it's also, I think, important, and Kristen, you may want to comment on this, and that is how quickly the annual budget increases when we just move one item, and that is compensation, right?
Correct.
And so as we try to adjust and make, try to be more competitive, even while we're cutting, that has the most appreciable effect, since almost 90% of our budget is compensation and benefits for employees.
Correct. So when you look at nearly 90% of our budget being compensation, when you look at mandatory increases like the Virginia retirement system that have been large, as well as providing employees with a salary increase, that really has driven our budget increases over time. It's been our largest cost driver. So this next slide summarizes the governor's proposed budget. None of the numbers have changed, but we redid this slide to be clear because I think our last presentation wasn't as clear as it could be. So Governor introduced his budget on December 17th. And when we look at that, the state's budget, as the governor presented it, would result in an increase to FCPS for state aid, not sales tax, of $6.1 million above our proposed budget. So that's what this new chart shows. But when we look at the state's budget, the state has, from FCPS's perspective, overestimated our enrollment for next year. And that's very important because all of the state aid is based on a per pupil formula. So if we recalculate the state aid using the enrollment projection that we believe is accurate, that we provided to the state as part of our fall membership collection, that would reduce that impact of the governor's budget by $2.9 million. So that would leave a net impact after our enrollment projections of 3.2%. Now remember, the state builds their budget for state aid based on that projection, but what we receive in revenue is based on that actual. So it's very important when we're looking at state funding that we're actually projecting enrollment because they will give us our final payments based on that actual enrollment. So once we adjust for enrollment, the projected impact of the governor's budget is $3.2 million. Now, the other caveat to remember is of that $3.2 million, $3 million is tied to FCPS adding those additional instructional positions for elementary. Remember that incentive funding totaled $3 million. So we will have to add those positions in order to qualify for that funding. In the event that we don't, the impact of the governor's budget would only be $0.2 million. So I just wanted to point out for the people watching online that our budget documents are posted online. From our main FCPS webpage, we have a budget landing page, and I included the link on the presentation, but you can get to that from the main FCPS page at the bottom. And on that page, you'll be able to access not only the budget documents for FY17, but all of the prior years. So if you're interested not only in FY16, but even if you want to know something about the 2007 budget, the links to the previous year's budgets are all posted there. We have a budget calendar, updates for our budget question responses. There's a budget video, the budget explainer video with Sammy, the budget highlights flyer that summarizes the proposed budget in 2 pages, and there's also a link to the budget task force. So in the event that we don't receive the revenue that we've asked for in terms of our request from the county transfer, the budget task force's identified reductions are posted online at this link. So lastly, I just wanted to go over the budget calendar and the upcoming dates. On February 16th, the county executive will release his FY17 advertised budget, which will include his proposed transfer to FCPS. Then on February 26th, the superintendent will present our advertised budget to the County Board of Supervisors at the joint Board of Supervisors School Board work session. And then on March 1st, the Board of Supervisors will advertise the real estate tax rate. That advertisement represents the highest that tax rate can be set. It's not the final rate that is adopted, but that's the highest that they can go when they adopt their budget. And then the Board of Supervisors will adopt that budget, including the transfer to FCPS and the tax rate, on April 26th. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Michael. Very, very thorough. Now, my colleagues, Dr. Garcia.
May I make one other comment, and that is, a budget's based upon a projection. So every year when we develop our budget, it's an educated guess, however, because we develop the budget based upon what we think our enrollment will be, what we think our compensation cost will be, what we think our utility bills will cost, but it's an educated guess. But let me tell you how close our educated guesses have been in previous years. This past year, I believe our year-end balance was 1.2%. I'm looking at Kristen so she can help me over here. The Board of Supervisors have a standard that they, year-end balance should be around a 2% as a rule of thumb. Ours have been well under that. We don't have the reserves that the County Board of Supervisors have available to them, so we have to be very careful with how we manage that budget. But I just wanted to emphasize that's how close we've been in recent years, because any money not expensed, not spent, falls out in year-end balance. And so, in fact, you'll see some of this discussion in third quarter review that's upcoming. Every time we don't spend money that we anticipated, we recognize that money, but we do budget pretty tight. And in my view, it may be getting to a point, it may be almost too tight. We've talked about this as a board before, because there's some unknowns. Utility costs could fluctuate one way or the other. Gas costs, gasoline, fuel could fluctuate, dramatically one way or the other. The only thing we have available to us is we have an annual $8 million reserve that moves forward in the budget every year, assuming we do not spend it. And that's our little bit of wiggle room should something extraordinary happen that it was not anticipated. But that's really the only amount of money that we have should something happen during the course of a school year. And our budget chair can tell you she remembers times when we could make payroll and things like that. So we have to be careful about that. But last year, if I'm not, am I correct? It was 1.3%?
You are correct, 1.2%.
1.2. So thank you I just wanted to kind of close on that. Thank you.
Absolutely, Dr. Garza. I was going to raise 2 points. One, in why we have the $8 million reserve. I actually was on the board when we did that. The year prior to that, the school board ran a deficit. Their projections for salary lapse and turnover proved to be inaccurate, and they discovered that in October. And it was an $18 million deficit. It was serious. And so finally, at mid-year, in order to slow it down, because by law, we must run a balanced budget at all times. So at mid-year, the only recourse the board at the time had was to take money back from schools. And so they took back supply and textbook money because they had to close that deficit. So the next year, and I believe I joined the board in the next year, I proposed that we put in a reserve, and it actually had been recommended by various of the citizen watchdog groups, because you can have unusual student growth, because the times that we have dipped into the reserve have been when we've had more enrollment than what we anticipated. One year we had a sales tax decrease. There was less money in sales tax than what we had anticipated. One year, again, where we had terrible snow conditions, as we have just had, we were short come February, March, and so we had to go into the reserve to balance the budget again to go forward. So that is why that is there. And then I have actually the first question, something that I know we've not actually addressed. And by the way, I reread the CAFR today, and it was interesting again to read the management letter and their assessment of year-end and the entire resolution of the last year's budget, which again acknowledged how close to the edge we were at the end of the budget cycle last year. Position control. A lot of people have not asked about that, but that is sort of an interesting discussion, because again, the major driver in our budget is people. We are a labor-intensive operation, but that there is absolute position control once you pass the budget. And I guess I would ask Ms. Michael, the process at quarterly reviews, in other words, a principal, somebody in an office cannot simply hire or add a position once the budget is approved. So Ms. Michael, if you'd like to explain that.
Yes, so position control is managed by the Office of Budget Services. So when the budget is approved, we know exactly how many positions are approved for every single school and department. And we put those in our HR system, which is Lawson, and then Human Resources helps school hire to those numbers. And then we watch that and maintain that all year long. And schools can't make a change to that without coming back through the budget process. So since positions compensation is nearly 90% of our budget, we very closely monitor our positions to ensure that they're being filled as we've allocated them, so they're accurate.
Great, thank you. Now it is the opportunity for you all to ask questions either on the presentation here. I do encourage you, while other people are speaking, to scroll through the most recent sharing of budget questions, because you may have other follow-ups. And not all the budget questions have been answered yet. They are still working on it, but if somebody has a burning need to discuss something that has not yet been answered, this would be an opportunity so that you all are ready for whatever vote you intend to make on Thursday. So, questions? Thinking time. Yes, Ms. McLaughlin.
A couple questions. I definitely appreciated some of the specific slides that gave us context with WABE. I think it's really important to help the board, the community, and especially the supervisors to look and see how our ask for FY17 is very much in keeping with the region and reflects how public schools are trying to come out of a recession and make up for drastic under funding that we've had in really the last 8 years. One thing that I was curious if we can find out, again, I think it's more about our ongoing conversation through the budget cycle, is finding out what each of the jurisdictions are saying their employee compensation is going to be within those budgets. So if we could end up seeing total compensation for step and increase or whatever. I know the number we've typically said is somewhere in that 3 to 3.5% range. When you add step and MSA together, I think that would be a really good way for us to also say, if the supervisors support our desire to have competitive compensation for our employees, then they need to see what the region's doing too.
I know that some of the surrounding jurisdictions have not all released their budget, but I believe our team has been capturing that. Specifically to your question about what their proposed budget includes with regard to compensation. So, Kristen, you want to touch on that?
Correct. We posted that. That's budget question number 7 that's posted. So it goes through each of the other jurisdictions who have released their budget. When you look at the chart, we included on that same chart their increase in their budget, proposed budget as compared to last year, as well as their increase in the county transfer. But what I would encourage everyone is not only should you look at the column that's labeled STEP and MSA, but you should also look at the text. So for example, if we look at Falls Church City in that budget question response, you'll see that they responded no to an MSA, but then in the salary enhancement notes, they talk about recalibrating their teacher salary scale with an average increase of 2%. So when you look at that chart, just be sure to look at all of the different columns.
And you said that's budget question number 7?
Correct.
Okay. And then the other question I had was, I know that part of our conversation dating back to the fall was trying to have fair and equitable compensation raises for our employees compared to the county employees. So do we know what is the most updated indications from County Executive Long, what he is thinking he plans to do for the county employees?
The last information that was shared from the county was at our joint work session in November, and at that point they were looking at an increase for their general county employees of approximately 3.33%.
So that concerns me.
Which is in line with us, because when you look at who qualifies for the step and who doesn't, I think we had this conversation at a recent work session, so it is right in line with what the county has included for their employees.
No, I appreciate that. What concerns me, though, is that if we are trying to have better collaboration between the school system and the county in this effort, I guess I really would have hoped that there would have been some sort of dialogue between the two operations to say, so are you still, knowing that when he presented to us, it was going to, that 3.33 was putting them somewhere with a projected $100 million shortfall, and ours was also going to give us somewhere around there. And clearly at some points the county executive gets closer, as he does now, February 1st, to seeing what we want to be able to do for both sets of employees versus what the county revenue is showing. I mean, I've gotten an indication that they were trying to get a sense whether that had to be revised based on the fact that we're now that close to making some decisions. So he's never indicated to anyone.
No.
an
In fact, I visited with
FCPS?
him, I talked with him today. I think it would be surprising if he would have changed that number this early in their process. They did change it from their projection in the fall. I think at that time they were anticipating a 4.2 or something like that. It was over 4%. And they did adjust that. I think it would be highly unlikely for Mr. Long to change it this early in their process.
Okay.
And like I said, I talked with him today. He didn't indicate any change at this juncture.
Okay.
I think they're just now beginning their budget conversations in earnest. Theirs is a little bit behind us.
That's okay. That's actually really good, because I think for those of us, when we go to speak to this proposed budget on Thursday and what we want to do, we can end up saying, it's to our knowledge, this still is in keeping with what the county hopes to do for its employees, and we would want to do nothing, we would want to do no more, no less than to make sure we're fair to our employees too. So, I mean, I think this is good. We can say this is as much as we know.
And may I add to that, Ms. McLaughlin? It's important to point out, too, that the total cost for the step increase for our employees, plus the 1% market scale adjustment, the total for that is, Kristen, if you remind me, I was trying to pull it,
62.2 million.
Okay, 62.2 million. That's just for a step and a market scale adjustment for our employees. The 3% will not even cover that.
Oh, it's been my constant refrain that that alone, they're shortchanging our system and not being fair and equitable. You do bring up an important point, though, and it's one of the things that I think it's important to have in our data documents. We say that the MSA is a 1%, but I really think it's important that we say what that step is. I don't understand why it doesn't say the step, which equates to 2 point.
It equates to 2.5% for
2.5.
those individuals that are receiving STEP, right? So that's the average for STEP-eligible employees.
Right. But again, I just think it's a matter of when the county's going to be saying we're shooting at 3.3, and I say, well, we're looking at a step in 1%, there's no context. So it's more helpful to say, for the average employee who's going to qualify for a step, we're looking at 3.5. The other question I have is, and it's a long-standing issue that's been an Achilles heel for us, and I really would like to put it to rest, and I'm glad you brought it up, Dr. Garza. You talked about our year-end balance, our carryover, and that, we've tried to be really as accurate as possible with about 1.2%, whereas the supervisors have usually 2% annually. It makes sense in one regard that they are the funding authority, and so they technically need to be funding their operations plus us, so they might have a greater cushion than we would. But one of the things I had really hoped, and I would like to see us achieve this year, is for the county to be very explicit, whether it's the supervisors and or the county executive, by financial best practices. what do they want Fairfax County Schools year-end balance to look at? I mean, we could end up debating it with them based on what we still feel like, the 12 of us who don't want to go to jail for a budget that, isn't balanced. But I feel like it's one of those things that 1.2%, which is really, as you said, as conservative as you'd want to get, but people just take the dollar amount and say, look at what you carried over, and we end up being the ones told. Our supervisors then start to publicly question, well, look at all the money you had left over. And I'd like to just put that red herring to rest. Just everybody agrees you've got to have this percent carryover. It's what we have. So to our chair and vice chair of the budget, I really would love to see us get there this year, and that as you're talking with them and that if that is to come up, I think it's really important, and maybe I'm directing the wrong place. Maybe it needs to be Chairman Hines and Ms. Evans on behalf of the board saying, as we present our budget, we also, feel it's really important that if you're going to start talking about our year-end balance, then at what point will you finally communicate to the public and everyone else what you want FCPS to look like? Because we keep having the same old tired conversation. It doesn't help anyone in the community. And then the other question that kind of it relates a little bit to prior work session conversations, I just wanted a status update. As you know, Dr. Garza, I felt it would be helpful to us to be able to have the information on the student enrollment that we didn't receive that we thought we were going to have, and how that existed within our FY16 budget. And I know at one point we were going to get something that provided an accounting for it, but the only information I found in the questions today, it was dated back to June of 2015. So I didn't know if you or Ms. Michael know if that's still something we're working on.
That is something that we're still working on, is doing a one-page fact sheet. I know both you and Ms. Schultz have asked for that information, so we are working on that.
Okay. And then the other thing is, I know another board member had asked, with Dr. Garza's proposal of the $40 million in our efforts to start narrowing the compensation gap with the region, which I fully support, but do we know, or is it something you're still working on in terms of how does the $40 million shrink that $53,000 gap in total compensation? Because I know we're not just trying to address the salary piece. We're looking at it that salary in isolation is different from salary and compensation that we give our employees.
While Kristen's kind of looking that up, I will tell you that the $40 million, just in general terms, gets us about halfway to the average. Pretty much on any way you look at it, whether it be total compensation or just straight out compensation. So the bottom line is, it doesn't get us to exactly where we need to be. It's just a starting point. Now, the mechanics of that, the board will have a lot of say in how we do that. And we also have an ERFC presentation to you all in April. So we'll be able to look at total picture and see how the board would like that money distributed. We could put more money where we're farthest, and maybe less on the fringes where we're closest. So there are a lot of options there. But $40 million will not close the gap. It doesn't matter whether you look at it total compensation or just full compensation. Did y'all want to add to that?
Actually, I think you covered it very well. The $40 million does take us to about halfway to market average, whether or not you look at just the salaries or the total compensation, which includes the benefits.
So the 40 million, the concern I have is the 53,000 or the 52,000 over 30 years in total compensation gap versus the 141,000 when you look at salary alone. I mean, those two numbers aren't half of one another. So I'm trying to figure out, how does 40 million get you half of the total compensation gap versus half of the salary only gap? So, I mean, the bottom line is,
The bottom line is, whether you look at it from total compensation or just salary. We're still not close to closing the gap.
Correct, and
So I don't know, it depends, the reason we haven't calculated exactly what the difference is, whether you look at it from total compensation or just salary. I mean, we're not even gonna get there, but it depends upon how we want to allocate the money. Because in some cases, we may get to the average because you may say, let's put it all in those certain years. It depends a lot upon the decisions that the board will make.
No, I understand that. I guess I would just say between now and when the supervisors are going to make their final decisions in April about the transfer amount, the sooner we can get that information to them about, you know, this is why it matters. This is why the 40 million is going to, I mean, it helps that they have some context to visually see this is what 40 million helps us do. And it also, I think, helps us get public support behind it as well and saying, look, this is, it's meaningful and it's going to do something. But if you don't have the context for how much it closes it by, I think we lose some of the strength in it, that's all. So I know, Ms. Strauss, I asked a lot of questions, but nobody raised their hand first, so I figured I'd just go ahead, and maybe I've now given everybody time to start thinking of all the questions they want to ask, and I
Okay.
may have a go back.
All right. Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. Other questions? Yes, Ms. Hines.
Thank you. I just have a few. To respond to Ms. McLaughlin's concern about the year-end balance, I agree. That's a perpetual red herring. And I was just thinking maybe, just a thought, on February 26th, when the superintendent you will present the budget to the Board of Supervisors on the 26th, and we'll all be there. So that might be an opportunity for us to bring that up and just kind of, explain it at the time, and either in your presentation or in the questions that we ask, because we have an opportunity to weigh in at that meeting too. So, but that's a very good point. I just had a couple of questions on slide 4. You talk about, step versus market scale adjustment. And I just wanted to make clear, it's true if we don't do the market scale adjustment, then we're not actually increasing salaries, right? We're just walking people through the step. But by the same token, if we're not able to give a step, that puts our employees behind regionally if the other school systems have given a step, right? Because that means that a 10-year teacher in our system is making less than a 10-year teacher in another system?
Correct. So if we look at if FCPS doesn't give a step, it impacts our individual employees. So our employee who would have stepped from that 10-year of experience to the 11-year of experience, right, would feel disadvantaged compared to the other districts where their service was compensated through that step increase.
Right, so it's just another way that we lose ground, either by not giving the market scale adjustment or not giving steps.
So if you're looking at an individual salary, yes, that's where we lose ground, right? It doesn't adjust the scale, but that's where our employees definitely feel that they're losing ground as compared to their counterparts in other school districts.
Right, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. Also, on slide 6, we talk about the difference between the increase in our budget and the increase that we're asking for from the county. And Ms. Michael, you said something along the lines of because the county's responsibility, or that the other folks who are responsible for funding our school system are not funding it at the same rate, or are not going to be increasing at the same rate. So
So when you look at our revenues, and we also answered a budget question about this, because our other revenue sources aren't increasing at the same rate as the county, that's why the increase in the county transfer, that percentage is increasing faster than our total revenue, because our other revenue categories, like state aid, for example, aren't increasing, or not increasing at the same rate.
Right, thank you. I just kind of wanted to highlight that a little bit, because it is true that our county support is really carrying the weight, and that's true. When they talk about that, I think it is true. So then getting to the slide 12, which is the state aid projections, I just had a question. So the $3 million that we would lose or not get is if we don't get the $10 million extra for the class size reduction, is that? Okay, so if we don't get the $10 million.
Right, because we have to, in order to qualify for this money, you have to add an instructional position at the elementary level.
Right, so my question then is, if we spend the $10 million, is it really $7 million?
Technically, but we have not recognized in the budget thus far, and I mentioned this in my presentation, because it's such a nominal amount of money, I think it did not even appreciably change the percentage of the ask. We were certainly hoping for a lot, a meaningful amount of money. So I think we'll watch this and see, but yes, if we're able to fund the 10 million, it could be offset by this 3 million.
Okay, thank you.
And I think I've said before, my team always has the opportunity and permission from me to correct me. Okay.
Okay, Ms. Schultz.
So I have just a couple of things. Ms. Michael, in concert with previous conversations that we've had, and I don't really see it as a budget question, but I recall it being a next step from a work session, was the question of being down 2,115 students and what that really translates to. And one of the things that I went back and looked at, for example, I looked at both our Q3 reportings and our WABE guide. And I know, Ms. Michael, you say that those figures are different in terms of what they include, but I recall asking the question, well, I think we need clarification. So if the WABE figure of $13,519 a student doesn't include food or something, if I recall, but we have in our third quarter budget presentation, the cost per student, local division, $17,086. Then the projection for the next year was $14,417. And I know it's quote unquote different pots of money, but the need to clarify what the actual cost per student is really important in terms of which document we're looking at. And I don't know if we need to have like a double, triple asterisk that says includes food, doesn't include food, includes, I don't know, whatever the different variations on a theme are. But, whether you go, the WABE figure, the current quarter, third quarter, the, pardon me, the next year projection, half of it, once you start multiplying times 2,000 students, I mean, even though it doesn't sound like a lot, it's how we base our ask when we generate an ask every year, because typically we've been growing. So we always had our ask generated on, well, we're going to have a student projection enrollment, and it's going to be 1,700 students or 900 students or whatever, and then there's the pot of money that's associated with it. I still don't see the reconciliation for how we discuss this, and now we're starting to get very pointed questions because we're getting close to budget passage time, at least for our advertised budget. How we address that as a part of the public when we've now backed into having 40 million for compensation gap closure, that a year ago we weren't really talking about that. We weren't talking about let's put $40 million into the budget. So I'm trying to reconcile those two, like a newer arrival into the budget dialogue in terms of the 40 million vis-a-vis we've got over 2,100 students that didn't materialize.
I'm going to start and then invite my team to add to this. A couple of things I would say. First of all, the 40 million, it was recognizing that we've gotten so far behind and the fact that we've lost so many teachers. We started the year with 200 open positions. The fact that those are challenges that are very real, that we felt like we had to do something. So a year and a half ago, did we think we had a problem? Yeah, we thought we had a problem. We knew we were getting behind in compensation. But our compensation study results, and coupled with the challenges we faced this year with staffing our schools, was the reason why that 40 million is just a signal to our teachers that we recognize we're behind and we've got to catch up. Okay, number one. Secondly, I think where you see a recalibration in our budget, knowing that, remember I said earlier, our budget's based upon a projection, an educated guess. We have experienced a change in our growth this year that we've not experienced in recent years. Every year we've been growing since 2013. It has been slowing the growth, and we've been lowering the amount of cost of enrollment growth since 2013. I think 2013 it was up at 40-something million was what was included in the budget for growth in 2013. That's been lowered over time. But this year it was particularly different from previous years. So what you would see is different is the fact that this year, in the fiscal year 17 proposed budget, we actually have no new money in the budget for growth. And in fact, we actually reduced the budget by 2.9 million in light of that. So we've completely recalibrated the budget moving forward. For the first time in a long time, there's no new money in our budget for growth. That's a good thing for our system. We'll see if that, we're hoping that this past year was not an anomaly. I think we'll have to watch it and see. But what we're saying in the budget then is that the money that was in fiscal year 16's budget, this year's budget, is sufficient to cover this year's growth and next year's growth.
I understand that, Dr.
And then
Garza.
in the third quarter, which is coming up, we'll be recognizing staffing reserve monies back into, that you'll be shown that we did not expend.
So I understand that, and I'm glad that you brought up the compensation, because basically what we're saying is a year ago, we could not have foreseen what we saw at the beginning of this academic year, which was a more rapid increase in terms of the impact. And that's the answer on that part, so that's the good part. I'm sorry, we're jumping around just a little bit, but in your earlier response, you had talked about potentially taking that 10 million, or whatever amount of money we decide at the time when we're allocated money, and that we might choose to allocate it in certain areas. So for example, like in certain years. You probably saw I had a puzzled look on my face because immediately I went to earlier discussions that we'd had with Ms. Quinn and Ms. Michael over selectively providing raises or, teacher classroom teachers only. And that sounds to me like you're talking about bifurcating a system that we've been told before can't be bifurcated. If you only apply raises to, incentives to teachers in certain years where the gap is maybe worse. Is that what you're talking about? Can you clarify that?
Okay. For the first, in recent past, and let me see if I'm answering your question, okay? So tell me if I'm not on, but what I think you're asking is, at least in my understanding of recent past, we've tried to keep all of our employees together. So whatever raises we gave to our teachers and we gave to our principals, that we gave to our food service workers, that we gave, so we tried to keep it all the same. So if everyone got a 2%, everyone got a 2%. Okay?
Not that necessarily all of us agreed with that, but that is what happened.
That's what we've done in the past. Okay? So this past fall, beginning maybe even in the summer, we began really talking with our employee groups about kind of setting the stage that we're going to have to consider the market as a driver for some of these compensation decisions. Now, we're not through with our compensation study. I think moving forward, more of that market-driven allocation of increases, I think we'll have evidence to show how we're going to do that. But that's why our employees really supported the differentiation in this year's budget for the teacher salary, additional money into the teacher scale. Now, so that's, I think, one piece of what you ask about. So we are bifurcating in the fact that we're saying this is an increase that we're recommending for all of our employees, general employees, all of them. But on top of that, we're asking for an additional $40 million to to help us get more competitive.
That part's separate. I'm talking
Okay.
about that first part. And so really what we're saying is that which somehow we weren't maybe necessarily able to do previously, now we're talking about doing, which is bifurcating it and driving monies to potentially certain areas of the pay scale that are less, have had less of a catch-up or whatever. So
Right.
you are talking about bifurcating,
Yes, I
basically.
am, and
Okay.
I think this is foreshadowing maybe more of that ahead as we have more of our market study and our long-term plan for compensation. But we have to have our plan first and our complete study. And I think down the road, one additional way that I think what we do want to differentiate is some differentiated compensation models where we're maybe driving even more money into hard-to-staff positions, maybe even hard-to-staff schools. But I think that's down the road, and we'll be talking about that in the coming.
Okay,
months and
so,
years.
so that, it's great because heading towards a market-driven compensation is something that I've been in favor of, and bifurcating is something I've been in favor of. So the fact that we're getting there is actually a good thing. I still am a little bit at a loss about the talk that we will be reporting in the third quarter the savings for the student growth. Because even if you take the lowest of those three figures from our different documents, and again, Ms. Michael, this is something I've worked through with you before, that's the WABE figure, which is, absent food and whatever, so it's kind of down to the bare, bones, bare necessities. That $13,500 times 2,000 students, we're at like $28 million.
Okay,
And I'm guessing that there's not going to be a $28 million recognition in the third quarter. So the question I'm really asking is what is the narrative, and is it forthcoming? Because we've been doing this for a little while now. What is the narrative that staff's providing for us on where that money is and why the depression of students or the reduction in the number of students that we expected hasn't resulted in a really significant savings. So that's what, in terms of the pressure that I get from constituents, I've got to be able to answer that.
I think we have a written response. I know we've done this at several work sessions, and I'm hoping we can put that in one document. But I think it's really important for our community to understand that once a budget is developed and approved by this board, the money is allocated. So it's all out there in schools largely, because that's where most of our money is, in schools. And then we monitor very carefully. It's out there. It's not sitting. It's all budgeted and allocated. And then what we do is we watch very carefully their enrollment patterns, what's happening, because remember the budget's based upon a guess. So we have to watch it. And so what we use then in terms of managing the execution of the budget once the budget year starts is our staffing reserve. Now, so if a school doesn't meet their enrollment projections, we pull a position back, we put it into the staffing reserve. If a school over here is higher because of maybe their class size or they have more students than expected, then they get a position. And so that's the way it's managed throughout a school year. And so you can't just say, well, their enrollment's not what it is, just take this number of students, multiply it by this other. It's not a fourth or fifth grade math problem where you can multiply and divide. It doesn't work that way, because we have to look at every school, every classroom, and see how that lower enrollment translated into higher cost or lower cost. And we've given this example before, and I think you even have shown it on a model, Ms. Michael, is the fact that if a school is lower by enrollment, their projected enrollment's 10 students less, even 20 students less than what we projected for them, just because where those students did not show up, it may have not translated in one staffing position different. So we can have an elementary school that has 20 students less than what we expected, but when you look at their staffing, there's not a position you can pull back just because of where the students
I appreciate
landed.
that, Dr. Garza, but I'm not talking 20 students. I'm talking over 2,000, over 2,100. And so the 2,100, if it's 20 students per school, then that's the narrative that I'm looking for is, was it 20 students per school? You know,
I was
do we
trying to-
only have, was there only a give, you know, here and there so that it was spread all the way across the division? But to say in a year where we had this wonderful administrative, and some schools may not have thought it was wonderful, but this wonderful administrative start where if you've overprojected, you know, 10 days in, we're going to take a pulse, and if you've way overprojected and you've way overstaffed your building, I'm really sorry, but you don't get to keep that staff. Well, that staff that was pulled back from schools that did not have as many as they expected,
That money wasn't spent.
zeroes out places where there was more staff than needed, and so
Not
there's
completely, and that's why we'll be recognizing
and
quite a number of positions.
that is, it's not completely, and that is exactly the answer to the question that I've been looking for.
And that's what we said
Exactly.
in third quarter, we're actually going to be recognizing a good number of positions because of that change in enrollment.
We haven't forgotten your question. Our staff member who would normally be working on it has been out. He's been very sick and was in the hospital and is now at home. So I promise that we haven't forgotten your question. So we'll ensure that we get that question to you school by school. When we look at all of the cost per pupil calculations that we do, we follow consistent methodology with all of the surrounding districts in the WABE guide. So you'll see that we report a cost per pupil in our proposed budget and again in our approved budget. So those are the 2 points, and we do use that consistent methodology. But when we calculate that cost per pupil, we take all of the expenditures and divide them by students. So when our number of students changes, we have many fixed costs that don't adjust. So whether we have 10 fewer students or 10 more students, for example, the cost of the utilities for that school building, the cost of the principal or the librarian, many of those fixed things don't change. So that'll be included in the response, but we will get you the detailed response that you requested.
Isn't it fair to say, though, that a fixed cost then isn't going to be driven up by adding 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 more students to a building? I mean, it works both ways.
That's absolutely correct.
So we've built those fixed costs into previous asks when the student enrollment was growing, and if they're fixed, they're fixed. And if we had 185,000 students instead of 187,000 students, the fixed costs are the fixed costs and have been allocated by the students that we already have.
So
there is a sliding scale where a new student isn't a whole new cost. And this is, I think, the essence of, I'm hoping, whatever budget response or explanation we're finally going to get. I mean, I think you're giving it in drips and drabs, but what's difficult is to weave it together so it is in one comprehensive answer that I can have with the public. I mean, I was supposed to have, in the last 10 days, I was supposed to have 2 sets of community town halls or community hours where I was anticipating a lot of these questions, and only by, whether you call it the grace of God or not, you know, whether it was Snowzilla or not, I've been given, an opportunity to keep that at bay until I reschedule those community office hours. So I'm already in a position where I have the expectation that when I have those, when I go out into the public and have these kind of discussions, once this budget is passed and delivered to the Board of Supervisors, that I need to have what are reasonable responses for reasonable questions. I'm just going to go back for just one quick second to the issue of the bifurcation, and not that that I have anything, and not that I'm going to offer an amendment at this time, but I want everybody to have that sort of just sit in the back of their brain that based on whatever the ultimate transfer is, if we're already in an anticipatory mode of bifurcating in order to shore up certain areas of the compensation categories that maybe are more not at market with surrounding jurisdictions, that there could be other reasons to bifurcate as well. So if there are reasons to potentially bifurcate to, and I don't want to use the term golden handcuffs, but, losing a teacher at 3 years or 5 years is very, very difficult because you've invested a lot in them. So, whether it's a special compensation at 7 years to get them to hold on or something, I just want everybody to have that, in the back of their mind, that based on what the transfer is, we will and should have the latitude to work within what remains to drive for the best teacher retention as possible. And it may be in different areas based on the completion of the compensation study, the need for retention, the cost of front end, and keeping experienced teachers instead of always going back, to the farm teams and starting over again. So,
Ms. Hines, did you have another question? She's not here. She's not at the table. Okay, Mr. Moon?
I mean, this is not necessarily for tonight, but since our work session is coming up, full-day work session on Monday, that's after we actually vote on the superintendent's proposed budget, though. But we have a compensation study as one of the topics for discussion on Monday work session. If someone could address, I know that's the only first part of this compensation, maybe just very first step of this long discussion we'll be having throughout the springtime. But if somebody could address what, because I don't see anything on the board doc specifically, which, what issues will be brought up to us, or it might be helpful for not only just for the board members, but the public as well.
I think those should be posted soon. I'm not sure, Ms. Quinn may be able to answer. At Monday's work session, you'll be receiving the report of the other positions throughout the system and where we stand in the marketplace. Then we will begin a discussion, just the first part of the discussion, around the philosophy with regard to compensation that the board would like for us to consider. I think, for an example, you've seen some where clearly other jurisdictions had, a philosophy around, they wanted a J curve. They wanted to emphasize and load, have higher pay increases during certain years, and it flattened at other years. So we'll be talking with the board about some general kind of approaches to compensation, where you all think we need to be in the marketplace. So that'll be just the starting point. And then in subsequent meetings, every month, we're going to be talking with you about compensation. We'll be talking about our current teacher salary scale, just like the one you just saw, how we might want to, a variety of different ways to adjust it into the future. So we'll be looking at lots of different models, but that's for Monday.
So for Monday, just for the people's expectation, both board members and public, and especially our employees, since we are dealing with their compensation issues, will we be, is it your expectation for board members to get into the area of what if, we get, assuming that we get the full transfer from the County Board of Supervisors, what do we do with this $40 million proposal on the table? Is that to the extent do you want us to get into, or is the staff prepared to address those?
That will not be discussed on Monday, Mr. Moon. I think there will be options that we'll be developing for you all, assuming that the $40 million is in the budget moving forward. With regard to all of the multitude of elements of the compensation study, I think for most of that discussion, we have to decouple the fiscal year 17 budget and compensation, because we're going to have to develop a long-term strategy and plan for how we address, where we're competitive and where we're not. The only exception to it is how we deal with the teacher salary and compensation piece. So we will be bringing some recommendations. I think that's in March or April.
That's in March. We hope to have those discussions in March.
Like what options we think that you might have available, assuming those dollars are available.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Hines?
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually related to that. I just want to make clear for everybody the extent to which we are including our employees and our teachers especially in that conversation, because I know that our teacher associations have been contacting us and they want to make sure that they're part of that conversation, but I think that's part of the consultant's work as well. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, there is lots of work being done on compensation, and, we're going to do our very best to get a lot of this done by the end of this school year, and it will result in a multi-year plan or strategy. We are conducting a survey of all of our employees right now. Those results will be shared with the public. We'll be using those results to go a little bit deeper into certain areas that we identify as issues or challenges or things that we really want to have conversations around, and we will be having focus groups of employees with regard to that work as well. So we will not be doing any of that work in isolation. In fact, I think the compensation survey is already out there, in fact.
It launched today.
Yeah, say it launched today. So, we're interested in what the purpose of the compensation study is to do no harm, but only to do good for our employees. And so we very much intend to have that work, just like our board wishes, for it to represent what we know our employees need to feel, to want to stay with us and to continue to do great work for us here in the system.
Okay, I will take a turn. With regard to the state budget, and this is a re-benchmarking year, and I think we've chatted about this before, but if we could spend a little more time on it. Normally, in a re-benchmarking year, in the first year of the biennium, the pie for education K-12 throughout the state is enlarged, but it's my understanding there are no changes in the formulas, so everything, again, is based on the current SOQs and ADM. So given that it appears that for the FY2017 budget, even though it is a re-benchmarking year, that we are not seeing any substantial increases.
I'm going to start on that while they maybe look like they're looking something up. I think that's probably the thing that was the most disappointing with what we've seen thus far. Certainly the General Assembly could change their allocations, and I know that we're continuing to impress upon them our need for money. But the re-benchmarking was ordinarily what we would always anticipate would increase monies to all schools, regardless of the LCI, that there would be an increase for everyone. That did not happen, and actually any money that was at least in the governor's proposed budget for re-benchmarking is only in the second year of the biennium, in fiscal year 18. So it gave us no relief in the current fiscal year 17 budget. And I think that's the reason we had some, I think, significant hope as we developed this budget, that, I think it was middle of December, end of December, when we got the governor's proposed budget. That was the area that was most disappointing, is that there was not money in for fiscal year 17 for re-benchmarking.
So we were very, very hopeful when we were thinking about the FY17 budget in terms of a potential increase in state aid. We assumed that we would get some funding for re-benchmarking. We also knew that we were going to lose funding based on the recalculation of the local composite index. So our projection for all of that was to hold our state aid for FY17 flat with FY16. So that was our projection that we started with. Then we kept hearing great news in terms of the governor's budget and additional funding for education. So when we look at FY17, that combined impact of re-benchmarking as well as our LCI adjustment, right, really did keep that state revenue pretty flat. And many of those initiatives from the governor are actually included in the second year of the biennium budget. So the restoration of the cost of competing funding for support positions, for example, the salary increase for teachers, all of that funding is in the second year of the biennium budget. At the same time, what we weren't expecting is that the governor would recommend an acceleration of the rate increase for the Virginia retirement system. So his budget proposal increases that rate to 100% of the actuarial rate in FY18. So while we're looking ahead to good things coming from the cost of competing adjustment as well as the teacher salary increases, once we look at that increased rate for the Virginia retirement system, it's really kind of unlikely that we'll receive an increase in state funding for the second year of the biennium as well. Right, so we did have some pretty high hopes, but any re-benchmarking really did end up being offset by that increase in our LCI.
Let me summarize that. Our high hopes were dashed.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's my memory that we have always enjoyed enough of an increase to make an actual difference in the first year of the biennium. Too bad. Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the response to questions that you provided today. It was very detailed in many areas, and I appreciate it, especially the response to question number 18, which goes through the detail of cuts taken over time. It's that level of detail that helps us understand how we got here, so I appreciate that. I do have a clarifying question on that, which is, and it's really about the step increase. Since 2008, how many years have we failed to give a step increase to our employees? And secondly, what percentage of our employee base would be eligible for the step increase that's detailed in the budget? That would be helpful to know. And then my third question, just figure I'll throw them all out there for you, is have we done any comparison of how our compensation is comparable to like jobs in the county side? So for example, you know, our psychologist, our school-based psychologist, how do their compensation packages compare to psychologists on the county side? How do our, you know, because one of the questions we had in that work session was, you know, over time, should we be looking at bringing these back together?
I'll answer the last one, and you get to answer the first two, because I actually think I forgot the first two. But the last one is, in our compensation study, any position that has a comparable position on the county side or through county government, we actually will compare to the marketplace, whether that be the county government or other entities. So if they have psychologists, social workers, a lot of our technology positions, you know, we do have certain positions that are comparable to county government positions, and those will be compared, and you'll get that comparison analysis. So the answer to your last question is yes, we will have that compared to the county.
So in the proposed budget presentation on slide 11, we go over our compensation history. So when you look at STEP, going back just since 2010, we missed STEP increases 4 times out of the 7 years, which is through FY16, and then we didn't have an MSA 3 years. So if you look back to 2010 and 2011, employees didn't receive either a STEP increase or an MSA, so absolutely no increase in compensation. We also missed our STEP increases in FY13 and FY14, and then we didn't fund a market scale adjustment of any kind in FY15.
Kristen, go back and say where you're referring to. I think everyone's looking on the
Yes.
slide, and it's not on the slide.
It's not in the slides from tonight. It's part of the proposed budget presentation that Dr. Garza shared in January. So
And can you
that's
give that
where-
page again?
It's slide 11. So for people who are looking online as well, that's the proposed budget presentation. So in addition to missing those, I also do want to point out that in some of those years where we did provide employees with a STEP or a market scale adjustment, we weren't able to fund it for the full year. So we did have times where we delayed providing our employees for a STEP, 2 months for teachers or 4 months for our employees. And then we also delayed a market scale adjustment 1 year to mid-year to January. So you'll find that information on slide 11.
That point's very important because it's difficult to show in the chart, so you have to read the kind of asterisk and fine print. But that's very important. For example, my first year here in the division, there was a 2% market scale adjustment that was approved for employees, but that didn't go into effect until January. So it was half a year before our employees saw any increase, and they did not get a step that year. So if you look just merely at the chart without looking at the asterisk. And then in fiscal year 15, we delayed the step for 4 months. So technically they got a step, but it was delayed.
It was deferred.
Deferred.
So what percentage of our employees were impacted over that period of time?
So when we delayed the salary increases or when we didn't provide any, it impacted every employee. So every employee who was eligible to get a step didn't receive one when they weren't granted. And when we didn't provide a market scale adjustment, it impacted everyone. When we did the delays, the delay applied to everyone.
No, I understand that, but what percentage of our current employee base? So if we look at how, if we replace our employee base by 5% per year, and we've done this for 4 years, then that means that
We would have
80%
to
have
do
been
kind of a
impacted.
guesstimate of how that would have affected employees.
Correct, and we typically haven't went back and restored lost steps or lost market scale adjustments that have happened in the past, right? So that isn't something we calculated. We haven't went back and said, you know, how many employees who didn't receive any salary increases at all in 2010 and 2011 are still working in the system. We haven't calculated that.
A couple of other things along the same line, because I think this is part of your question too, is when we do a step, not every employee gets a step, not everyone's eligible for a step because they may be at longevity. So on average, about 95% of our employees, anytime we do a step, they qualify for a step. Isn't that correct, Kristen, about 95%?
That's correct. So employees who are on steps receive a monetary increase. Employees that are on a hold step, so when you get to the top of our salary scale, if we go back to that slide, you'll see that we have some longevity steps, and they're what are called hold steps in between. So you have to hold for a year before you can move to the longevity step. When we grant a step, employees receive credit for being on the hold step. If we don't grant the step, because no employees step, those employees don't receive credit. So then the employees that are at the very top of the salary are on that last longevity step. When steps are given, they don't receive a step because there are no additional steps for them to go to.
So about 95% of our employees on average qualify for a step when we have a step. Then the final thing I think I would like to point out, just because you had someone testify about this last Thursday night, and it's handled differently in different places. Just like when we delayed the step until November by 4 months for our teachers every year get their salary increase when we start the school year. All of our other employees that are 12-month employees get their increase on their anniversary date. And I guess it's been that way in Fairfax County since the beginning of time, maybe. So that's not, and you had an individual, a bus driver, I believe, testify about this last Thursday night. So I wanted to, you might not understand the mechanics of what he was referring to. And anyone that's on a 12-month, that's the way their salary increases have always been done. So every year their increase would happen on the anniversary date of their hire. So, for example, if I was hired in January, whatever salary increase that the board were approved in the budget, the budget went into effect July 1, I would not get that raise until January on my anniversary date.
Correct. The step applies for 12-month employees on their anniversary date. We do apply the market scale at the very beginning of the fiscal year. So the salary scales adjust July 1st. Step occurs on your anniversary date if you're other than a teacher.
Ms. Hoff?
Okay, I have a series of questions. So I know a couple of the questions I've asked so far haven't had a chance to be answered, but I didn't know if there was a status. One of them was about the difference in projection from a budget question asked last year about it costing about $2.5 million to drive elementary class sizes down below 30, and this year we're accounting for 10 million?
Sure, we're in the process
That was
of
fiscal year.
answering that.
Be careful, that was from fiscal year 15, so I want to make sure that was right.
So when we look at that estimate that we did in FY15, as Dr. Garza pointed out, it's important to note that we increased class size in the FY15 budget. So since that estimate, our class sizes went higher, so we had to reduce them back. And then when we created that estimate, we were assuming that we would have combination classes both across grade levels and between general education and advanced academics, which in practice we've seen very few combination classes. So we are working on that answer, but those are the two biggest driving factors.
And we don't like to force combination classes because only in certain cases it can be very successful, but it has to be a teacher that knows how and is comfortable with it. So combination classes is not our first place that we go when we're trying to respond to class size challenges.
Okay, thank you. And then in relation to that, what would the cost be to meet the state requirement to be eligible for the $3 million? So of that 10, how many positions do we need to create? I know it's one per elementary, so what does that cost compared to the 10 million we're asking for?
So looking at really kind of big rough math, if we assume we have approximately 140 elementary school positions, the state funding says we have to add an instructional position, so depending on what level of position we were to pick, if we assume a teacher with salaries and benefits combined, perhaps using a salary of $75,000, right, you can see that it's slightly less than that $10 million that we have in our budget, but we would need to add approximately 140 teacher positions at $75,000 each.
Okay, so it would be about the 10 or something just sub 10. Okay. And then another budget question I had asked was about charging the $1.1 million for living wage of food service workers to the self-supporting fund versus our operating fund.
Thank you for that. We're also in the process of answering that question, so you'll get that question in writing as well. So our food and nutrition services program is a fully self-supporting program. They pay all of the costs for their salaries and benefits as well as indirect costs to the operating fund. So if we look at our food fund over the most recent years, food services has had expenditures that have been higher than their revenue going back from 2012 through 2016. So in order to balance their budget, they've been using their reserve funds over that time. So we do have a new food service director in place. We're working on program enhancements and increasing participation. But knowing that our reserve funds are pretty low in that fund, right, we do have concerns about moving that cost for the living wage to that fund. One of the things we are looking at for next year is the possibility of needing an increase in lunch prices just to cover the increasing cost of that fund, both for food and employee salaries and benefits. So again, we are working on that answer and we'll get it to you shortly.
And I want to add to that, we'd have to, I know that we're looking at what the cost would be just for the food service employees in that 1.5 million. Not all of that was for food service, so it would be a portion of that, a high portion of that,
Correct.
I believe.
It's about 1.1 of the 1.5 is for food
Okay.
service workers, and we are answering your question as well.
So we're looking at that to see if that could be moved down the road. We can certainly consider that. The board knows that we had the prismatic study. We are spending, more in our food service costs just because we're trying to add a lot more fruits and vegetables, our salad bars, those kinds of options for our kids. And obviously that makes our food cost higher. But as we continue to look at that, we think that's certainly something that we could consider, and we'll have an answer for you.
Okay, say one more thing. Okay. Thank you. And I appreciate that. I think that one of the things I've been sharing and want to continue to share is that I think one of my concerns is that as we talk about the teacher salaries being a priority and we talk about the lowering the class sizes as a priority, then what does that mean for us? If it's a priority, it's something that we regard as more important than something else. And then how do we as a board find what those things are so that we can make sure that we are putting into that priority what we're asking all of the community to put into that priority. And so is one of those things, is excellent, and I want to see healthier foods and I want more people buying into it. When we're talking mission critical, where are we going to land on prioritizing our teacher salaries? And I just want to keep that in mind. And I do have one more question. I know you actually you addressed it in the beginning with your opening statements, and it was a question I had as I was at Costco filling up today. Where do we account for the fuel costs that clearly we've had savings this year? I've had savings, and then going forward next year, if that was accounted for.
Sure. So we look at our fuel costs. We actually purchase our fuel from the county. It's through what we frequently call DVS, which is the Department of Vehicle Services at the county. And together with the county, we purchase our fuel through a cooperative trying to get the best fuel prices. So one of the things that you'll see as we head into third quarter is we'll talk about savings that we've had in fuel and also additional costs that we've had in terms of snow removal. We had previously adjusted the fuel rate looking at our FY17 budget, and we'll continue to watch that trend. And if we feel we need to make another adjustment, when we come to the approved stage of the budget process, we would make a recommendation to change that rate.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I go back? Dr. Garza, you
I
had...
would just point out in fiscal year 16, I get so confused with the years. I don't even know what to write on my checks anymore. What year is this? Is we actually, a lot of the savings that we recognized last year is we went through every central fund and pulled down costs as much as we could. I mean, we'd already cut those funds a lot, but we did yet one more time this past, the current fiscal year. So we lowered those costs a lot when we were getting into this fiscal year. But anytime we have lower costs than anticipated, we will recognize those at whatever time during the year we can. One year we recognized significant health insurance costs because we had a change in plans, and because of what employees, the plans they picked, we had some savings. So anytime we have savings in the budget lower than, costs that were lower than anticipated, we will recognize those at the quarter where it makes sense in the budget. And that includes fuel cost, health insurance, lots of other things.
And again, third quarter is the next opportunity for any adjustment, and the date for that coming to us is?
February 18th.
Okay. And we do our last student enrollment count, which again is an adjustment before we all decide on the budget for next year. That date is?
In March. So we'll be working on, we just actually had all of the departments back together looking at our timeline for completing all of those spring projections. But our last official enrollment count for this year is March.
Great, thank you. Okay, Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Dr. Garza, one of the things that's consistently mentioned is that we lose teachers to nearby jurisdictions. So how many teachers have we lost this year to nearby jurisdictions?
You want to answer that? We actually, for the first time this past year, started capturing that information. A lot of times when people leave, we don't know where they're going. So we have to do exit surveys. And so, Susan, you want to speak to that?
Sure. Even through the exit surveys, they don't identify where they're going as they're leaving FCPS. What they do provide is what are their top reasons for leaving FCPS. And outside of personal reasons, it ends up being pay and I have to go back and try to recall, but pay is one of the top 3 reasons that our employees are leaving FCPS, but they don't provide where they're going.
We in the Goal 3 report that was presented to the board in November, is that correct? We had a lot of that analysis, but we do struggle with having the specifics. Now, you can go to individual schools. I promise you principals can tell you exactly how many they lost and where they went to. But, we're trying to get better handle on that information, but it has been difficult.
So do you have any of that anecdotal evidence that it comes from the principals? Just to, even just a rough ballpark of how many actual teachers have left this year to other jurisdictions?
I think we could survey principals and ask them without too much problem to do that.
Okay. I also would like to just make a general statement about my concerns about the ask, because although I appreciate the optimism and am support of paying our teachers a competitive salary, and of course having as much money as possible in the classrooms, it seems like this ask significantly exceeds the historic average of the actual transfer. I think it was, maybe it's, I'm not sure which slide it is that has the list, and then the 5-year average, I think maybe it was 2.49% was the actual transfer with adjustments. This transfer increased by 6.7%. So I guess I'm a little concerned that maybe we are overly optimistic in terms of what we're going to actually receive. And so in light of that, and the likelihood, I guess, that we will not receive 6.7%, you mentioned that there's a list that's come out of the last year's budget task force. Do you have like a top 3 that you think will be the initial places that you'll look to match the transfer to the actual needs of the schools?
Well, Mr. Wilson, I will tell you that we will respectfully disagree with you about the ask being too high. I believe it's an appropriate ask. I think it's reasonable. I think it's justifiable given the fact that we've cut for so many years, and these are costs that have been outside of our control. So it's not as if our budget has increased over the previous years because we've added all these wonderful new programs and services that we want to do, and you know, we've cut things out of our budget. We don't have a cycle for technology. We're not funding our pre-K like we'd like. Our salaries have been lagging, and it's because we've had cost drivers outside of our control, and the only way we've been able to fund those is to cut. And so I believe it's an appropriate ask, and I think it would be, in my view, it's an appropriate, and in fact, probably I should be asking for 12%.
Yeah, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that the ask is too high. It's only that in comparison with the average transfer that's been actually made by the county to the school systems, what is the approach that you plan to take, and can you give us some idea of where those cuts will come if we don't receive the 6.7%?
And I think that was the reason why we felt like it was important last spring and summer as we started visiting with the board about our approach for fiscal year 17. We knew we would have to engage our public in this conversation because we didn't want to find ourselves right now in a place where what's happened is when we find out what the transfer amount will be, at that point we're already getting ready for the next school year, hiring teachers. We felt like we had no other choice but to cut back on our compensation, increases for our employees. And so all of that information conversation with our community has been really to help them understand that those are very real things that we will all have to consider, assuming that we do not get the 6.7% increase. So I believe, we've been very honest with our community about the fact that that whole list of items will be what we will have to look at in the coming months, assuming that we do not get the 6.7% increase. Now, I've done my homework, and I know many of you have, and we've visited with you all. I know you all have prioritized potentially how you would approach where you would go should we not get the 6.7%. And I think the challenge is, finding consensus among which programs and services we wish we would cut, or what compensation priorities represented in this budget would be reduced. So those are, I think, the challenges that we have in the coming months, assuming that this budget's not fully funded. But in my view, it's very appropriate and should be fully funded.
Okay, but just to be clear, you don't have those priorities already in your notebook in your office somewhere that you could share with us so that we sort of have a sense of what we are going to be faced with. Because I guess one concern I have, and this is something that I've heard from constituents, is household incomes still have been very flat in the county. Census Bureau numbers, I think it was actually dropped in 2014 from 2013. Home values based on sales numbers for the past 10 years is the lowest increase for the past 10 years than if you look back 40 years. It's very low, and it's the citizens of Fairfax County through the taxpayers of real estate taxes. They're going to have to bear the burden. So I think it's going to be difficult for the Board of Supervisors to make a transfer that meets the 6.7%.
Well, I think I think the points are certainly all well taken. I will tell you that I think there's evidence of the fact that the economy is rebounding, You know, now if you look 10 years back, certainly there are, but even some of the county's own numbers with regard to commercial real estate or residential real estate, certainly the economy is rebounding in some ways. But at the end of the day, you know, in my view, and certainly as superintendent, I believe our responsibility is for taking care of this school system. I certainly am very mindful of the challenges that our supervisors have. You know, that's why they were elected into those positions, you know, to make those really hard decisions about how do we take care of this entire county, and that includes taking care of our school system. It doesn't necessarily mean that whatever we ask for has to equate to total increases in real estate. Those are choices that they have to make. What is the pie? How much of it does the school system get? How much of it does any other county service get? You know, those are the decisions I certainly, you know, they have to make. I certainly appreciate the fact that those are difficult decisions, but at least the way I approach this is we need to do the things that are fiscally responsible. We need to do our part, and I certainly believe we have. But at the same time, we've got to take care of this system. And I believe we're at a real turning point. And I'm not just saying this to scare people. I just feel like when I look at that next list of things, we go to that list, or even if we change our goals around compensation, either of those pathways take us to a place that I don't think that it's good for the system. And so I think, at least my view, that's why I proposed a budget to you all for consideration that I believe keeps us the same and does no harm to our system and helps us start to turn the tide, in my view.
Well, I truly appreciate your commitment to the county, and I believe it's totally genuine, and I think that your candor in terms of answering the questions is apparent. And I do think that every budget line that you have has a great justification for it. I guess my thought is that looking at the historic figures, you know, we need to be preparing now, and the more information you can give us on terms of where you see, let's say, a 4% transfer budget priorities being met.
Yeah, you know, I have, although I find it distasteful, I have prioritized, you know, the list that we have available to us. I think it's important, I'm glad you asked this line of questioning, because I think it's important to also remind the public that for 2 years, I've been here 3 years, the 2 budgets I brought to this board before had historic cuts in it. So it's not as if I'm reticent to make cuts. I've done that, and I've done it in significant ways for the system. My first year here, I cut 731 positions. So it's not as if I was not willing to make cuts, but I'm not willing to make cuts that significantly compromise the value and the quality of this school system, and I think that's where we are right now, and I just could not do it. I'm very well aware that the ask is high, and Mr. Wilson, honestly, I'd hoped as we developed the budget, I was hoping to be able to subtract from that with some additional state money for re-benchmarking, and that did not come to fruition, at least, not yet. And so that is unfortunate because I was hoping that would help us. And, we'd be in a very different place today in terms of what that ask is.
Well, thank you.
Mr. Press?
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. One of the most unpredictable kind of factors that's in flux when we begin our budget cycle is student enrollment. And as we know, and as we've discussed previously, students don't come to us in nice even bunches of 20 or 25 or whatever. Now we also know that students don't come to us in big bunches of 100% general education students. We know that our special education populations and our ESOL populations have been increasing to historic levels. So I would ask how we've been factoring that into our enrollment growth, as we know that those programs tend to be more expensive. They require more one-on-one staff time with students. The class sizes tend to be smaller within those programs. How we're factoring that into our enrollment growth. So I'll let you answer that one first before I move on to my next one.
We factor that in every year, and in fact, last year, if you were following our budget development process, when we put in our budget growth, it says growth and demographics. So last year, in fiscal year 16, we developed the budget. It had $22.1 million in it for student growth and demographics. It was interesting because, again, like I said, it's based upon a guess for next year, right? We were experiencing last year a significant increase in the number of level 1 students in ESOL. So I think it was like in February where we had to yet adjust our ask by about $3.4 million, if I recall correctly, because there are increased costs for programs and services for certain students. So it is based upon not only growth that we would experience, but also cost for various programs and services. And Kristen, you may want to add to that, but that's basically the answer to your first question.
So for students receiving special education services or students receiving English for speakers of other languages services, we actually do projections that includes the service level for each of those students, and then we calculate the staffing needs and compare back to the prior year. So we do project for all of those different service levels by student.
So when we're predicting that demographic change, when we discuss, we obviously wouldn't have expected that increase in level 1 students because we don't have a crystal ball that tells us these things. But when we are, predicting what we might see in the future, are we using current levels and using a percent growth, calculation? Are we using, trends across Virginia? How exactly do those, you see what I'm getting at? How exactly do we come up with the numbers of we're going to have X increase in special education population, X increase in ESOL population?
Again, it's just based upon experience. We measure experience, we look at trends over time, and we guess based upon our best information we have available to us at the time. Now, keep in mind, there are some years where we have to use more staffing reserve than we do other years. So in some cases, our guess, we may get children we may need more special education teachers because we have an increase based upon different, IEPs, et cetera. So once we start a budget year, our only way to adjust to those demographic needs, but beyond our projections, is our staffing reserve. And so that's why some years, I think it was last year, we actually ran out of staffing reserve and we had to go to our schools to give back positions that they had not filled, because we used every bit of staffing reserve in fiscal year 15, okay? And it was because we had a huge increase largely in ESOL students needing high level of services, more than what we'd ever experienced in previous years. So that's how we deal with it. We guess, use the best information we have, and then if it goes beyond that guess for some, like anomaly like last year, we have to go to our staffing reserve.
No, I appreciate that, and I just wanted, to
and
have
I
that
know
point
Kristen's impressed that I remembered all that from last year, right?
One other piece, Mr. Press. In special education, people often say, well, are you over-identifying, under-identifying? Actually, the percent of our student population that we identify is slightly below the national average. We are at about 13% of the population. But what has happened over time is that there is an increase in the intensity or the need for services among that 13%. But I know sometimes people in the community will say, well, are we attracting? Are we unusually a magnet? And so that trend line is interesting to see. Are we at about the national average for the percent of children who you would expect to require an IEP? And we're at about there. And also remember that in special education, considering that we also, our services begin with preschools, preschool special ed, that we are taking in preschool age children all year, and we are staffing those programs all year. And some of those youngsters qualify for what we call ESY, summer services. So that is always that is very important that we figure out the reserve number, particularly for those children, because the projections and the actual experience may be a little bit different than what you would for what they call cohort survivability. Once the kids come to us in kindergarten, you kind of figure who'll be there in first grade, who'll be there in second grade, but then trying to figure out who's coming as a 2-year-old is an interesting challenge. So that's how that one goes.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for humoring me on that question. My second question is one that we're really starting, well, I'm certainly starting to hear a lot about, and it's not necessarily a budget-related discussion, but one that may have budget implications, and this is very much a hypothetical, because I don't necessarily predict that the board might take this action, but if the board and system were to move in a direction of having a pre-Labor Day start in either school year 16-17 or in a future school year, would we recognize any cost avoidance or cost savings as a result of that, or would we predict it would probably just be the same?
I wouldn't imagine, because I wouldn't imagine there would be significant cost savings one way or the other. And that's because we still have to have a 180-day student calendar. We have to have a 196-day or 194-day employee year for teachers. So unless we were to appreciably change those parameters, you're just moving the boxes around a little bit. So I don't think there would be any appreciable savings if that were to change to pre-Labor Day start. And that is definitely hypothetical, since the board, I think, is scheduled to talk about that at some point in the future.
Yes, very, very much a hypothetical, but I figured I'd put it out there at this opportunity. My last question is about the Cadillac tax. It was in question number 17 in budget questions. The answer notes that Congress decided to postpone, to defer the implementation of the Cadillac tax, it says, till 2020. But it says later that there's calculations performed saying that the calculation would be $110,000 in 2018. Obviously, I think that is probably invalidated by the fact that has been pushed back. Are we looking at changing our health insurance plans before that point? If so, are any of those changes expected to be implemented in 16-17? And could we expect a cost savings as a result of that?
Okay. Let me start with saying we've had a number of sessions and conversations about this. We had long planned to have a task force completely look at our overall health insurance plan, in light of the fact that we knew that that the Affordable Care Act and the Cadillac tax would potentially go into effect. We did have to go ahead and make some changes to our insurance plan this year. We've talked about this with the board. We had hoped not to have to make any changes until the next calendar year, but our fund would not have remained solvent unless we made some changes. So we had to make some changes for this calendar year. Our health insurance is on a January to January calendar year, so it's different. So our employees went through an election this November, and we actually have just now started our new healthcare year. At the same time, we're convening a task force to look at overall plan design changes for anticipation that we'll be able to implement those with enrollment for January of 17 moving forward. So I don't anticipate that we will incur any tax for what is called or referred to oftentimes as a Cadillac plan, but there are a lot of moving parts with the Affordable Care Act. With regard to savings, we have, like other organizations, I'm sorry I didn't answer that part of your question. Like other entities, our healthcare costs have been rising over time. We've tried to mitigate those costs to the extent we possibly could. This current budget before you does have increased cost in our healthcare plan, and that's because as the plan increases, we have to pay a certain percentage and our employees pay a certain percentage. So as the plan changes, we have to increase our cost. The board will probably recall we had a conversation about this. A lot of our increased cost, just like other entities, you may have been reading about it for other organizations. Largely it's around pharmaceutical increases. There are a lot more designer drugs available, It's good news for a lot of our employees because they're really making a difference with regard to their health, but they're very expensive and there's not a generic version of them. And I think we talked about some examples of that when we met and talked about this. In addition to that, a lot of the technology associated with a lot of our healthcare is also exacerbating our cost. There are a lot more technology in response to various health conditions, and that's created rising costs with insurance. So I don't anticipate a time in the near future where our costs would go down for health insurance. Unfortunately, I think we'll continue to experience the same thing that surrounding jurisdictions and really other entities experience, and that's the continued rise in our healthcare cost.
Are there any other questions, comments? Yes, Ms. McLaughlin.
First of all, I wanted to circle back on two budget questions that had been answered for me, but I think it's really important that there be just a little bit of clarity, because I'm hoping that these are the questions that will help our budget chair and vice chair and Dr. Garza when we were talking with the supervisors on how important it is to be fair and equitable in their funding to the school system. Ms. Strauss, I so appreciated in November when we were all together for the joint meeting, and you asked to me one of the most important questions of the day to Mr. Long, which is based on what you're forecasting to spend on yourselves versus what you're planning to spend in increased funds for the school system, what's that going to look like? And the 3% increase for us paled in comparison to the 5.5 he was projecting to spend on the county. So I had asked for a bar graph that I just want to make my colleagues aware of. It's question 21. And Ms. Michael, I just wanted to make sure, because then I also had in question 8 a bar graph that you created, and as I'm reading it, they look very different. And I think it's question 21 that gets at what I wanted to ask, which if you add up the percentages, which I think would be more impactful than just saying the average annual increase. Because I think what we're trying to say is when you look at fiscal year 10 up through fiscal year 16, and you add up the total percent increases that they spent on themselves versus what they gave over to us, they have gained 14.3%, and we've gained 11.2%. And that to me, again, is to help the supervisors, some of whom said to me individually, well, the reason why we might get 5.5 in fiscal year 17 and you'd only get 3 is because we protected you during the recession, and now we're just getting catch up. And so this bar graph, Ms. Michael, on question number 21, it's saying comparison of county transfer to FCPS operating fund versus other county disbursements. Am I reading this accurately, that this was the chart I was asking? Because it does match the transfer increase numbers I'm seeing on the county transfer history.
So in the two questions, in the first question, number 8, what we compared was the total budget increase for each organization. So that looks not only for FCPS at funding coming from the county, but our total budget increase compared to the county's total budget increase. When we get to your budget question number 21, that's comparing how much funding did the county transfer to FCPS for our operating fund compared to how much did their total disbursements, excluding the schools, go up. So how much did they give to us versus spend on their programs? Just two slightly different questions.
Right, and so I just want my colleagues to know question number 8, that is not what I wanted, and I'm a little worried because if you look at it, because it was total increases in, I guess, disbursement increase is what it's saying. It ends up looking like in 9 budget cycles, FCPS had 20.7%, increase in its funding, and they had 16%. So if from the supervisors were to look at that bar graph on question 8, they'd say, well, see, you've had more funding than we've had. So I don't know if I can withdraw my question because it's not what I actually wanted, and I'm worried it's going to create confusion. But I will say that I very much appreciate the information in question 21 because that gets at what I think the apples to apples conversation of how's the county each year when it's got its revenue, how's it taking any increases in funding to itself and funding to us. And what you will see is we have not received the same percentage of increased transfer amounts.
I think if you look at question number 8, it also shows that we probably had much higher cost drivers that added that pressure to our budget. Because what that is showing is an increase in our expenditure budget. So not necessarily the funding from the county, but because we had direct cost drivers that were growing at a much faster rate.
Right, no, I understand, and there was a caveat in there too with the double asterisks about fiscal year 2013 when we had the whole VRS, but I guess I'm just asking the question since it's not actually information I think that's relevant to what we're trying to understand, and it might actually confuse a reader because, quite frankly, understandably with staff being overtaxed, there's no analysis in this. And the bar graph without analysis, I think, could be misleading and confusing. So,
And it sounds like it wasn't what you
it
were
was not what I
asking.
was asking
Okay.
anyway. So I like to save everybody a lot of time and confusion and have question 8 withdrawn because question 21 is the information I wanted from the very beginning back in November.
Sure.
Is that all right with everybody? Anybody? Okay.
Sure.
I believe I have the 21 is the right bar graph. That tells me what I wanted, which is this is what the county increased in spending to
Within their-
itself and what they gave to us.
That's correct, within their budget.
Yeah,
Keep in mind also, just one little caveat. And remember, y'all can correct me anytime I'm wrong. But keep in mind, the county also pays in their budget for some of our positions. In fiscal year 15, where we cut 730-something positions, their budget actually, they added positions back in their in the county side. They added positions back. The only positions they cut were SAC positions.
Well, and
Is that correct? So some of the positions they may have cut were actually on their side of the ledger, but it affected some of our programs and services to families. Am I correct on that, folks?
Well, I appreciate you providing that additional context, and I would certainly welcome that being added to the answer in question 21. But I think it's just my personal advocacy to Dr. Garza as well as to our budget chair and vice chair that I hope as you're having the conversations with Chairman Bulova and I believe Supervisor McKay are working as co-chairs of the budget, that this bar graph be a real part of the conversation, which is we are trying to be fair and equitable to all of the county services that serve Fairfax County residents. And when you look at that bar graph, we're not doing it. And so you cannot put forward an FY 2017 budget at 3% to us and anything above 3% to themselves. And that includes the great question that Ms. Strauss first posed, which is in total, what are you going to be spending on yourself? So, and then I just also want to say that I appreciate some of the extraordinary work that many of our colleagues were engaged with this past week and over the weekend up through today, trying to talk about ways that we can, as a board, continue to understand the complexity of this budget and really help also prepare us as well as possible in speaking to the public about where we are with the budget priorities. And my final thing I just wanted to share is that while I have continually said, especially since November, that if the county's not asking itself to make any cuts at this time, then I had no expectation for Dr. Garza to come forward and do the same, because at minimum, we need this maintenance of effort of our budget, just as they're trying to do with theirs. But I do want to just raise the issue that I think Mr. Wilson was really trying to get to, which is our board obviously is uncomfortable when we've been faced with, how do we reconcile whatever transfer amount we get, and then what do we do with revising our advertised budget. And Dr. Garza, you went to great lengths to get your budget task force of stakeholders throughout the county to say, all right, if we're faced with some difficult decisions, here are sort of in a rank order of what we think are most sacrosanct and what are the ones that we don't want to lose, but if we have to, those are ones we would consider. And so I guess I don't want to be stating the obvious to my colleagues, but there really hasn't been a lot of discussion on where people are in terms of if the what if happens. So I don't want to have it either right now. I don't think we need to. No one's asked anybody to cut, and I don't think we need to volunteer it, but I do hope everybody is not I just hope people are really looking at the great work that your task force did, Dr. Garza, so that we don't find ourselves in early May, suddenly saying, well, I don't know, I haven't thought about what that, would do to a system. I think between now and then, we just have to be thinking in a very mindful way. And, but most importantly, I think we have got to hammer home the point that fairness and equity for the schools and the county, and hold our citizens accountable too. Their voices matter, and we've now brought a budget forward, and we need them if they want the strong schools, and they've been emailing all of us, but now they need to make sure that they truly come forward in those Board of Supervisor hearings and say, we know we emailed you, but now we're here in person to tell you, do right by the schools just like you want to do right by the county.
Ms. Derenak Kaufax?
No questions at this time, Ms. Strauss, but I just wanted to say thank my colleagues tonight. I think everybody has had a lot of questions, but thank you for your thoughtful questions tonight and for the dialogue. I appreciate that very much, as well as the questions you submitted to staff. And thank you to the staff for your hard work. We know you're understaffed a little bit right now, and I know you're working as quickly as possible to get the information back to us. I really appreciate that. And I guess as we move forward, this is something you all know up here already, but please feel free to reach out to Janie or myself if you have questions or concerns about timeliness of things, what's being answered, or if you just have historical, for particularly some of the new board members, if you have questions and you want to say, well, what happened in the past? Do you have any knowledge of the hows or whys that this happened or that happened? I'm thinking about this. So please take the time to do that. I know it's not always easy to connect, but we will try, and we'll make sure we get together and talk to you about what we need to do as we move forward in this budget process.
Thank you. I have one last piece, I guess, to add to some of the answers. And going back, for example, to the budget question on slide 14, which was the question 8. One of the things that was significant for Fairfax County Public Schools and public schools across the country at the beginning of the recession was the federal stimulus money. And that saved an awful lot of school systems and saved a lot of teaching positions. And then from the state perspective, when they dramatically changed the funding formula from the VRS. And so when we answer the questions about FCPS budget versus the county budget, I don't know that we explain well enough those two aspects, because that obviously those two pieces made a dramatic difference in the county funding. And in other words, their transfer did not have to be as high because of the assistance we were getting from the federal government and the state. So I don't know, Ms. Michael, if that ever gets incorporated in some of the historic explanation of between the county and the school's funding.
When we answered that question, we didn't go back and give the caveats for what drove those expenditures each year. So we didn't include things like federal stimulus funding. We didn't include program enhancements like full-day kindergarten or full-day Mondays or other pieces as well.
Right. But I would suggest that the federal stimulus money, because that had a dramatic impact on public schools across the nation. And of course, there was the hope that the recession would turn around fairly quickly, and it didn't, which has been part of our difficulty here in Fairfax County. But that does account for some of the differences in funding levels between what we had to spend in the schools as opposed to what the county did.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, are there any other questions? Budget amendments due tomorrow at noon, if anyone's considering anything. But other than that, again, any other questions, conversations that anybody has, please let us know. We're all here to help. Dr.
And
Garcia.
just feel free to call upon our wonderful financial services team. I think they're down about four people right now, and they're already an understaffed department. But they, I know, are working around the clock, trying to make sure that you all have what you need to make decisions. And please know that you can call upon me anytime, day or night. You have my cell phone number. I stand ready to do what I can to support you as well. So please, this is all of us taking care of our great system, and I'm mindful of how difficult these decisions, but how important these decisions are for our system moving forward. So thank you for your work. Appreciate it very much.
Okay, thank you all very much, and we'll see you on Thursday. We are adjourned. Thank you.